You should have received a guidebook via email yesterday. And we just wanted to share that this is something that you can engage with at your own pace. It's really self-directed. You could pick the different activities based on kind of how you're feeling that day. And just to note, it's not a guidebook that's kind of like going to walk you through our presentation today. So if you happen to have it open, you're welcome to close it and you can pick it up at a later time. Our goal for this introductory workshop today is to kind of identify the mental health, emotional impacts of climate change. We're going to provide lots of tools and resources that you can practice as an individual or in community. And we're also going to have the opportunity to practice some of them together. So we also want to share, we're very happy to have Amanda with us. She's the mental health consultant with Staff Wellness. We also have Megan McKay and Hannah. They're the student support advisors. Thank you so much for being here. Climate change and climate grief can bring up some really strong emotions, and this is really normal. So if today at any point you're feeling really strongly and would like some extra support in processing those emotions, you're welcome to reach out to Amanda if you're a staff or faculty, or Megan or Hannah if you're a student, just directly over the Zoom chat, and then you'll go in a breakout room with them, and have the chance to chat more with them. So as we get started today, we welcome you to kind of introduce yourselves in the chat. You can share your name and the land that you live on. We do want to highlight today that we have so much to cover. It's only an hour and a half. So unfortunately, in this introductory webinar, most of our engagement is going to be over chat with you. Although Jodi and I would really love to be able to connect with everyone in person and have more conversations. So you're definitely welcome to reach out to us after today's session. So to start in a good way, we'd like to take this moment to acknowledge the Treaty 7 territory. The University of Calgary is located on the heart of Southern Alberta, and it both acknowledges and pays tribute to the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region. This includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, the Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. So acknowledging the land is a really important part of reconciliation to honor Indigenous cultural practices and help build respectful relationships. In the context of today's session around climate change, climate justice, and climate grief, we'd also like to name that climate change is a really complex, wicked problem that has lots of dynamic contributing factors and root causes such as capitalism and colonialism. We want to hold space for the different experiences of grief, climate emotions, and trauma people have related to this topic. Indigenous communities are the most impacted by climate injustices, but they're also at the same time leaders in climate action, and their knowledge, worldview, and ways of doing is really vital to a healthy planet. So we are very grateful for their leadership and knowledge sharing. We name these truths to decolonize how we talk about climate change and climate grief, and to really hold space for everyone's lived experience and what they might be bringing to this conversation, and also for everyone's opportunities for healing around this topic.
Yeah, and when we do this, we create these spaces as a part of our action towards decolonizing, because we're giving ourselves the opportunity to connect with our own stories and the ways that we might be feeling. And we enter into a space that helps us to acknowledge how climate change is connected to broader oppressive systems like capitalism and colonialism. And we can then, from there, we can integrate this knowledge and use it to ground us as we move forward to support or to take justice actions as a part of reconciliation.
So we want to invite all of us to continue on our educational journey on truth and reconciliation, and how that can interconnect with climate justice and climate grief. Today's session, we are focusing on climate grief, but we also wish to honor all the types of grief we might be carrying with us today individually and in our collective communities related to current and ongoing oppression all over the world. Hey, so thank you again so much for everyone who's been joining us. Jodi and I are now going to introduce ourselves a little bit more and kind of share with you how we came to this topic of climate grief. So my name is Alana-Dawn. I'm a third-generation settler. My family's heritage is Icelandic, French, and Scottish. I've been really fortunate to be able to pursue my passion as a career path, and I've been working in sustainability and climate action for 10 years now, and also done some community organizing. I have an eco-social work background and a master's in international community development. So if you're unfamiliar with eco-social work, it's similar to what you imagine traditional social work and community social workers do, but we bring a lens that really understands how interconnected our human health is with the planet. And we also bring an anti-oppressive lens to individual and community interventions, where we try to also advocate and address root causes to some of these oppressive challenges, sorry, that really address the root causes. So I came to learn about climate when I was in it, when I was like kind of really angry, frustrated, and sad, but I didn't have the language for it. And a really kind friend put in my hands the book Act of Hope, which I actually meant to bring today to show you all, but I highly recommend it. It's by Joanna Macy, and we talk a little bit more about it today, but it covers a lot of practices to help you kind of process your grief and just like really validate it too. Um, so yeah, through that book and my continued work in social work, I did a lot of research on the topic and just became pretty passionate about it.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing, Alana-Dawn. My name is Jodi Lammiman, and my pronouns are she and her. And I am a first generation settler and newcomer-ish to Canada. I moved up here when I was 18 from the US. I come from a family of artists, teachers, and farmers who largely come from Scotland, Ireland, and Poland. And I have a master's in leadership and over 15 years experience working with folks at the intersection of contemplative spaces, as well as social and environmental justice, mental health education, and social emotional learning, largely in community development spaces like the YMCA, the library, and through a number of retreat centers. I'm also a mindfulness-focused spiritual director, which is kind of similar to a coach, and a facilitator of the Work That Reconnects framework. And one thing I always kind of say at the outset of these sorts of things, and I'm noticing it now, is that I have a bit of social anxiety. So I always feel a bit anxious to start out the beginning of these sessions. If you're feeling that, both Alana-Dawn and I are right there with you, and hopefully that'll dissipate as we move together in this. And I always want to name that because part of my work is really around destigmatizing conversations of mental health. And I think that starts with myself. So part of the work that I do is through an initiative called Refugia Retreats that I created in 2016. And Refugia is actually a scientific term that refers to places where small pockets of life endure and become spaces for life to grow and even flourish in the midst of climactic upheaval. The story I've often relate this back to is from Mount St. Helens when the volcano there erupted. Scientists came in about a year after the eruption and didn't really expect to find any life propagating. And yet they found these small spaces that actually allowed life to regrow much more quickly. And that's really a metaphor for what we hope to do at Refugia. So Refugia is a small initiative that through workshops like this, through retreats, and through one-to-one support, creates spaces for people and communities who are experiencing ecological and climate grief and anxiety. We also foster our understanding of nature as a teacher and guide, and it's a place to practice inquiry-based learning and mindfulness practices. And I also, similar to Alana-Dawn, came through to this work through my own eco and climate grief. In about 2013, I was living at a retreat center with about 8 other people, just about an hour north of Calgary, where I live now. And there was an active clear cut happening. So they were clear cutting about a 25-year cut block. So what should be done in 25 years in 2.5 years. And I could see and hear the clear cut from where I was living. And it impacted, we had a wolf pack kind of move into the area. It impacted all the land around us as well as our neighbors. And yet a lot of my community was really resistant to get involved in any sort of advocacy against forestry for a whole host of reasons. And this really amplified my eco grief. And then I started to learn more about forestry and the connections to climate change as well. And that amplified my climate grief. And kind of out of that time, I was lucky enough to be trained in the Work That Reconnects, which Alana-Dawn just talked about, Act of Hope and Joanna Macy a bit. And so I was actually able to be trained by Joanna for a couple of weeks. And now I utilize that training in my own experiences as I create spaces for other people in their grief. So that's a little bit about my background today. I'm going to share a few invitations with you of how we would like to be in the space together today. As Alana-Dawn said, unfortunately, there's not a lot of room for group discussion or chats outside of the chat box today, but we do want to invite you into the space in a specific way. So here are the invitations. An invitation to be curious about whatever unexpected things arise in yourself and others, not rushing to change or fix them, but rather holding them gently and non-judgmentally. An invitation to co-create this group workshop by showing up authentically, compassionately, and responsibly. An invitation to slow down and to move at the speed of your body and emotions, listening to when they might be asking you to enter in, to take some space to reflect, or to take a break. An invitation to respect confidentiality for yourself and others, honoring the importance of boundaries and privacy. So as I said, we're not going to have a lot of room for discussion, but we will have a breakout room with a little bit of discussion towards the end. And this invitation is just a reminder that any stories that gets shared within this space, we want to invite you to leave them within the space. But any skills or knowledge or tools that you learn, please take them and share them widely. And an invitation to do what you need to take care of yourself and to remember that this isn't a clinical space. We're not trying to fix or save or diagnose anyone. We're really just trying to show up as a community space. So doing a bit of co-learning today. And an invitation to remember that we each come with our own unique and different stories and life experiences, and to welcome, respect, and value the unique experiences in this room. So I'll just leave a minute for us just to sit with those invitations, and then we'll move into a bit of an agenda. All right. So for today's agenda, this is what we're hoping to cover throughout the hour and a half that we're together. So we started with introductions and a welcome. Then we'll be moving into climate emotions, terms, and research. We're going to do a reflective journaling activity, and then look at some tools and resources for climate grief and climate emotions. From there, we're going to move into a meditation together, a group discussion, and then some resources and a time for question and answer. And we're going to get started just by talking a little bit about wellness. So when we think about the work that needs to be done to respond to climate change, we often think about green technology, the shift to renewable energy sources and the economy. And all these issues are important, but it's equally important to focus on wellness, mental health, and community care. And there are 8 different multidimensional aspects of wellness. These are emotional, mental, financial, spiritual, intellectual, social, physical, environmental, and occupational. And for the purposes of today's session, we're going to focus on emotional, mental, environmental, and to some extent spiritual, with a caveat that I define spirituality or spiritualness as anything that helps people find meaning. And for many folks who are interested in climate change activism and climate change work, meaning often comes from connection with the natural world. So I also want to note that each of these things intersect, and they all make up aspects of what makes us well. A few years back, I heard author and anti-racism educator Shakil Chaudhry interviewed on CBC talking about his book, Deep Diversity. And he said something that I think is really relevant to this conversation. And that is that emotions are the work of social justice. And what's at stake if we don't create places to process our emotions is that we as a society don't make progress. Emotions are also the work of addressing climate change. We live in a society, specifically in Canada, that social scientists have deemed as death denying. And this means that we aren't comfortable with emotions that we see as hard or negative emotions. And we don't often have a lot of spaces for those emotions in our society. And I think that if we don't create spaces for people to process these sorts of emotions individually and together, while also addressing people's complex emotions and connections to the environments they live in, they will burn out and we will become isolated in our own pain. And so equally, Dr. Michael Ungar, who's the founder and director of the Resilience Research Center at Dalhousie University, says that resilience is more about supportive systems than individual capacity. So this makes creating the capacity for community processing and mental health supports incredibly important. And I presume you all know that and feel that, and that's why you're here today. And so we're grateful to have this opportunity to talk about this together. So today we're going to be talking about our mental health practices, about how our mental health practices and community care can help us build wellness and support ourselves and each other. And we're going to do that by first learning a bit about common language for challenging feelings about the climate, tools that support our mental health, and practices that are supportive to community well-being.
Thanks, Jodi. So yeah, we're going to start off with some terms. And the reason we want to do this is because it can give us like a really common language to express how we're feeling. And it's really important to have language for that because it's really validating and can help normalize these climate emotions that we are feeling. Particularly like a lot of us have probably been carrying around these emotions for a long time, like I kind of shared in my opening. And then once you have language for it, you're actually able to really articulate it and you're able to connect with other people who are feeling in the same way. So that's why we're starting with terms. So climate emotions, the common climate emotions are anxiety, worry, fear, anger, frustration, despair, empathy. So the love you're having for communities and plants that are impacted and animals and wildlife by climate change. Guilt is also a really common climate emotion, often feeling like we're not doing enough. Shame, shame for the impact humanity is having. Numbness also is, when you just can't handle what you're feeling, you just we can tend to numb out. Denial. This is different from like not believing in climate change. It could be like over wishful thinking around the tech solutions instead of, really looking into that deeper work that we're trying to do today is really process our climate grief, to look at value changes in our systems. There's also positive emotions around climate change. So I'd say like love, the love you have for the earth and life, the joy you experience, when you can really tap into understanding how interconnected you are with, water, trees, all of those things can really bring immense joy and pride, when you see just taking in how beautiful like the fall trees were for me. Like every morning that I drove to Calgary, I really soaked in those beautiful gold trees. So those are also positive climate emotions. And we did have a question come in from a participant, so thank you for that, to really talk about how we can really process our anger around decision makers who are maybe stalling the progress we need to make. And that really resonated with me because anger tends to be my really top climate emotion that I go to. So just a personal story, like Lake Winnipeg, I consider it to be my best friend. It's also drinking water for the Broken Head First Nation and farmers that have wells around Lake Winnipeg. And there's a corporation that wants to have a frac sand mine built right there, of course, impacting the water. So I got super angry around that and like what kind of helps me. And it's going to be different for everyone. But we'll also be covering other strategies you can consider. But just being able to talk to someone who understands and they don't even have to say a word to me. They just give me that nod, like, I get it. That's awful. Like just validating how I'm feeling is helpful. I try to be more mindful when I feel like my mind is kind of racing with angry thoughts and I'm not really like doing anything about it. So I try to catch myself. I'm like, okay, this is anger telling me that I need to do. I find writing letters really helpful. I know a lot of us might be tired of having to write these kind of letters or sign the petitions, but in this situation I shared with you, it actually really made a difference. The community really organized this letter writing campaign and it actually stalled the company from going through with the frac sand mining. So it can make a difference. I also find for me physical movement, like actually, working out, going for a walk with my dog or going for a run, like the stress and those emotions, like physically are released from my body. And then I have more of a clear head about what I want to do next. That's more healthy and can make an impact. So yeah, it's just really important not to get stuck in that anger because it could lead to more mental health concerns like burnout. So yeah, I just really encourage, just first connect with people that you can just express yourself and feel really validated with. I don't know, Jodi, if you wanted to add any like thoughts around that.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I have a ton to add there. I think anger is also something that I go to pretty frequently with some of the climate impacts that we're seeing, particularly here in Alberta. And I think something that helps me has been movement, but also community spaces, like also having a group of people that I can get angry with and not have to be worried about like sanitizing how I feel. So there are some rituals that we can maybe talk about at the end that actually bringing anger into them or allow you to kind of express that anger. I think another thing that's been helpful for me is actually just like trying to befriend my anger and asking it what it is looking for and what it needs, and recognizing that anger doesn't have to be a negative emotion. It can actually be an emotion that fuels us into action as well. But yeah, thank you for sharing, Alana-Dawn.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, so we'll move on to some of the next terms, and maybe we can circle back around to that at the end if there's more questions or more if people have things they'd like to share about it as well. So the next terms are ecological grief, ecological anxiety, and ecological despair. And each of these refer to a reaction that comes from the environmental loss of ecosystems. They can refer to both man-made losses, like that of a forest from a clear cutting, or from naturally caused losses, like a mudslide. The next is climate grief, climate anxiety, and climate despair. And these are all other terms for eco grief as well. And they kind of can get intermixed in some of the literature out there. And they all reference the reactions that stem from the impacts of climate change. And researchers Ashley Consuelo and Ellis say that this is grief that is felt in reaction to experienced or anticipated ecological losses, including the loss of species, ecosystems, and meaningful landscapes due to acute or chronic environmental change. And then the next term is place bereavement. So this refers to the loss of a place. So examples of this could include refugees might feel place bereavement at having to leave their homes. This could also be something like a move, or even something like the development of housing where there was once a park. And then the next is radical acceptance. And before Alana-Dawn gives the term for that, I just want to say there are a number of different kind of like definitions out there. And we've just chosen a few of the most popular today, partly just for brevity and time. But you'll find a few more in your package. And I just want to encourage you to go out there and look at what terms are already out there and kind of find ones that work for you or that feel like they connect for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I just came across this term this summer around radical acceptance. And it really resonated with me because it really entails like facing the truth about what's going on in the climate situation and accepting our complex feelings around it and just holding it in our minds and hearts. Kind of the loss experience, the loss that we won't be able to prevent, but at the same time, staying functional and engaged in the world and not turning away. So finding that balance of engaging with your emotions, but not getting stuck in them, I think is really, really important. So, yeah, this is a new term I discovered. It really resonated with me.
Thanks. And so as we know, climate change is a complex problem. So it's probably not a surprise that climate grief and climate anxiety and some of the climate emotions are also complex. So some of the specific challenges that arise with these climate emotions are a feeling of anticipatory grief or anxiety that comes before a loss. So some of these terms are actually coming from bereavement or grief literacy. And anticipatory grief, an example of this could be that often gets used here is the impending death of someone who maybe has cancer or dementia and you're watching them decline. I think when we think about climate change, a personal example for me is in usually April, May, we start to experience fire season here in Alberta now. And so kind of leading into April and May, when the weather is supposed to be starting to get nicer, I can notice myself starting to get more and more anxious about what that's going to look like and whether or not we'll be able to go outside and what the smoke might bring or what the fires might bring this year. And that's a form of anticipatory grief. The next is chronic or complicated. And this is kind of similar. It's an ongoing or heightened state of mourning that doesn't resolve with time. Using my previous example of fire season here, I think that's also an example of chronic or complicated grief or anxiety too, because it is reoccurring and it seems to get more complicated over time. So the first few seasons that we were really starting to have more significant fires and more significant smoke here, I was noticing that shift in my body around anxiety in connection to that, but it wasn't as chronic as it is now. Now I can almost immediately go there. I was actually in the States this year when the fires started up here. And I was tracking them on the news, paying attention because I kind of just felt in my body it was that time of year and things were shifting again. And so that's a form of chronic or complicated grief. The next is existential. Andrew Bryant, who's a clinical social worker working in climate aware therapy, says that climate change can feel like an insurmountable threat. Because of the largeness of the scope of it, it's hard to find an action step that will assure people that their fear and the existential dread is going to dissipate. And I think that definitely is something that we struggle with in the midst of climate change. And then the next is disenfranchised. And so disenfranchised loss is a term coined by psychologist Dr. Kenneth Doka, and it is any loss that is not socially sanctioned or validated. So this could be the loss of a cherished pet or a landscape. It's traditionally things that we think about that we might not kind of socially all understand as like why that loss would be meaningful. So I think we can all understand that a loss of a cherished pet would be very meaningful. And yet at the same time, we don't have a societal structure where you could take a week off of work to mourn that pet. We don't even have that societal structure often when it comes to mourning a loved family member. And so that is a form of disenfranchising our grief. So as I mentioned earlier, social scientists have deemed Canada as a death-denying society. I'm also, I believe it's Canada and the States that I've specifically seen deemed as death-denying. And this can create a stigma that can keep individuals from validating or acknowledging how they're feeling. It can also keep people from getting support. It doesn't quite feel socially appropriate or validated in most settings in Alberta to talk about climate grief or anxiety. So again, coming back to that example I just shared of being in the States when we had over 100 fires burning here in Alberta. When I flew back to Alberta, I have a partner who's actually in emergency management. So he was up north with some of the fires. And when I flew back here, it was sunny and it was not smoky at all. And I went to work and I went to a few places with friends. And I really wanted to talk about my climate grief, my climate anxiety, and what was happening with the fires. And every time I brought it up, it just felt like there was a lot of resistance to that. People weren't ready really to acknowledge that. And it was really interesting because about a week later, we started to experience smoke here. And suddenly everyone was talking about it in a certain way. And so that is actually a form of disenfranchised grief, wanting to bring that up and wanting your grief to be validated and it not being. So a couple of other quotes here come from Dr. Leslie Davenport. And she says the widespread denial of climate change losses prevents our emotional pain from being socially acknowledged and validated. Those touched by this grief may be viewed as overly sensitive, as exaggerating the issue, or even as emotionally unbalanced. These responses can encourage individuals to isolate, to remain silent, and become disenfranchised from their own grief processes, rather than move through it with support. Surprisingly, climate grief is even disenfranchised within communities of climate scientists and activists, even though members of these groups may experience grief the most due to the level of exposure to the issue. Because grief emotions are often not discussed in scientific settings, many feel isolated in their experiences of grief, even while surrounded by those who feel similarly. And a quick example there, a few years ago, I was working with some folks that work in climate and environmental law and also environmental science. And as I was getting ready to do a facilitation with them, I received so much kind of pre-feedback from them around some of the burnout that people were feeling and the anxiety and the distress that they were feeling around the work they were doing. And so after the facilitation, the feedback that I got was that there were a few folks that felt very uncomfortable talking about this or even just the topic with their coworkers because they didn't have an environment where it felt safe to have these sorts of conversations. So I think there is the mental health stigma as well on top of some of these conversations, but also we haven't created spaces where we can actually validate and re-enfranchise these conversations. And so that's part of what we hope that Alana-Dawn and I hope to do here today. And we hope to resource you to do as well.
Thanks, Jodi. So now we want to talk about some of the specific symptoms of climate anxiety. So if anything that we've been sharing around the terms is really resonating with you, please know you are not alone. Shortly, we'll be talking about the research and it backs it up that it's very common that people are feeling this way. And the reason we want to go through specific symptoms, it's important to recognize how they might show up for you so that you're better able to find some of the tools and strategies that we'll be covering that will work for you. So some of the symptoms include appetite changes. So this could be from eating less, eating at really weird times, maybe like eating so you don't have to feel your emotions, aches and pains, which might be hard to assess, but if everything's kind of like going as usual in your life, but you're noticing like you have some really stress in your back or holding tension in your shoulders, it might be your climate grief. Like climate grief, for those who are really aware, like everyone who's joining us today, it's kind of this constant, it's there. It's kind of always in the back of your mind, even if you're not thinking of it. So aches and pains could be a sign. Irritability, so having less patience or quick to be annoyed, fatigue, sleeplessness, anger. We've talked about that too. It's really tough when kind of how serious this climate crisis is and you're not feeling the solutions being put out there are enough. And that also kind of connects with what Jodi was saying about disenfranchised grief. So not only is it hard to talk about our emotions in a normalized way, which we're going to continue to do, and which you're all doing here today, which is really awesome to see you all having these conversations. We're disenfranchised from the solutions that we want to talk about, right? Like, so I want to connect to that too. Sadness, despair, social withdrawal is also a symptom of climate grief. Like if you're feeling tired and you're noticing that you're like withdrawing from friends, that could be related to how you're feeling around the climate change. Um, Urgency and constantly working and burnout. I wanted to talk a little bit more about that because they kind of go hand in hand. Like if you're really feeling strongly in your climate grief, you could be constantly working to try and make change. And I just want to caution that that doesn't lead to burnout. If you've experienced burnout, it takes a little while to come back from. And it's just really important to kind of catch yourself before you get to that burnout stage. And that's why it's just so important, if you recognize these symptoms in yourself, to kind of just really take that pause, to take care of yourself and try and figure out the best way to process your emotions. And without judgment. Don't like have compassion for yourself and the emotions you're feeling. So now that we've talked about the different terms and symptoms, we want to really share how we could start to attend to our grief and anxiety. So again, I just really want to start with, validating your own emotions, normalizing it for yourself. Like it is a natural, normal response to be having grief to what's going on in the world today. It's not like an illness that you need to fix. It's really a symbol of your love for the world and your love for life and your love for nature. It's a sign of like having a really good heart and a really good conscience. So just be kind to yourself. Um, it's it's a good sign to have this grief because it means you're aware. So there's no right or wrong way to grieve. So just recognize that, and there's no timeline for it as well. We really encourage you to find those supportive friends that you can have these conversations with. At the University of Calgary, there's a student-led group who runs climate cafes. It's the every third Friday of the month, and it's held at the Women's Resource Center from 5 to 6:30. Jodi hosts the Work That Reconnects group. It's a monthly meetup. I think it's every third Monday of the month. And yeah, thanks, Jodi. I mean, she runs through facilitative activities to help kind of engage in these discussions. And the Good Grief Network is an online program where it's free, and they also host these discussions where you can really connect with other people and have these conversations. The last one we want to share is action, and I'll just caveat that with like when you're ready, like if you are in feeling some deep climate emotions and climate grief, like really give yourself that grace and time to really process it. It's going to help move you forward. It'll help make you more sustainable if you do take that pause. And we also wanted to highlight that there's a recent study from Yale that indicates collective action is really better for our mental health than individual. This work should be community-based. So we, again, just encourage you to reach out to others that you can connect with on this topic. So we're going to move into our first activity and tool that can help in processing our climate emotions that we'll practice together. This is called reflective journaling. So we are going to invite you to, for the next 3.5 minutes, journal on these 3 open sentences. A place that is magical to me is. what concerns me most about the world today is, and ways I express or avoid my feelings about the world are. And I know 3.5 minutes is going to feel fast. So, Jodi and I just encourage you just be really intuitive about it, be in the moment, just write down whatever is coming up with no judgment. You can definitely come back to journal on these 3 topics later. So, we'll give you those 3.5 minutes now. And then in the last minute or so, we'll invite you to share if you like in the chat.
Thanks so much to those who did share in the chat. Yeah, it can be a bit challenging sometimes to get into these sorts of activities, and especially with that we've only given you 3.5 minutes. But it is helpful and interesting to see how people connect to it and to get to reflect a bit on that on our own too. We're going to move a bit into talking about the research around climate grief and anxiety. So I will say this is a bit of a burgeoning field. So there is kind of a lot of research out there and a lot of research coming out as well. However, not a lot on community supports around climate grief and climate anxiety yet. So hopefully that's something that will be coming in the next while as well. So as we look at the research, Alana-Dawn, if you don't mind, thank you. Perfect. This is a large-scale research study that was done in 2021 of about 10,000 young people in multiple countries from, I think it was over like 10 or 15 different countries. And it was young people ages 16 to 25. And what they found is that 59% of respondents were very or extremely worried about climate change, with 84% being at least moderately worried, which is a really high number. And then if we look at the next one, over 50% felt sad, anxious, angry, powerless, helpless, and guilty. And over 45% said their feelings about climate change negatively affect their daily life and functioning, with many reporting a high number of negative thoughts about climate change. So yeah, I think this is helpful to look at, to kind of recognize that we are not alone in the ways that we might feel. And also that over 45% of people said their feelings about climate change negatively impact their daily life. And that's a really large number. And it is part of the reason that it's so important for us to build supports around having these conversations. The next piece of research we're going to look at is actually a little bit more local. So looking in Canada, in a 2019 national survey of 2,000 residents of Canada, aged 18 and older, 49% of respondents indicated they were increasingly worried about the effects of climate change, with 25% indicating that they often think about climate change and are really anxious about it. There is really similar research that just came out of Yale that's US specific. So those of you who are in the US, I'd recommend that you take a look at that too. But I think this is really interesting to look at. 49% of respondents indicate that they're very worried about the effects of climate change. And if we look a little closer even to home, for those of us who are in so-called Alberta, this is the research that's coming out of Alberta. So the first two points are from research studies that have been done through the U of C. And then the third one is actually an article from, I think, the CBC actually. And it's really interesting to look at how we frame things in Alberta. I think because of the politicized nature of climate change in Alberta and the polarization of climate conversations, it's really important to notice that disenfranchisement shows up here. We're not actually naming climate change as the overarching system through which these mental health challenges are occurring. And yet the 2013 floods and the 2016 Fort McMurray fires were deeply connected to climate change. So what happens when we don't actually name climate change is we also lose out on seeing the system and the way that these things are connected. And we also lose out on the ability to address these issues as systemic issues. And I think it's just important to name that and to start to recognize, like, how do we talk about climate change here? And as we move forward. Next, perfect. So in Canada, we do often tend to talk about mental health in a personal and individualized way. And in order to take care of our mental health, we need to know ourselves, we need to set boundaries, and we need to know our capacities. But we also need to acknowledge the structures that exist on a systemic level and the ways in which they do or they do not support mental health. And equally, it's important for us to look to our communities and understand that we can create systems of care and mental health supports together. So as I mentioned earlier, Dr. Michael Unger's work on resilience really highlights that personal resilience is deeply connected to community resilience. And so I don't think we can really talk about personal mental health in a nuanced or a holistic way without also recognizing the ways that it's connected to community and to collective care, as well as to the structures overarching all of that. Taking care of ourselves and community care are two sides of the same coin. As humans, we're an interdependent species. So it's really important for us to realize that our ability to care for ourselves well and to be cared for well also impacts how we show up in our communities and how we treat the environment. So we're going to talk about some tools and some resources that can both support personal mental health, but can also be done in community as a way of creating capacity for community mental health conversations. And as we move into this section, I really want to invite you to kind of hold both personal mental health and community care, community mental health together, recognizing that each is necessary for the other to exist. And a kind of a final just comment about that before we move into some definitions of community care. So there's a researcher out of the US named Dr. Alyssa Appel, who's a psychologist, who finds in her research that social support is the biggest predictor of wellness or resilience. So it's important for us to kind of come back to these definitions. So collective care refers to seeing a community member's well-being, particularly their emotional health, as a shared responsibility of the group rather than the lone task of an individual. And it recognizes that we live in systems that are interdependent and that our ability to be well intersects with our community's ability to be well. And I don't think we have to look very far to see examples of that, but I think one overarching example that we've all experienced in the last few years is that of COVID. So if you can switch to the next slide, please. Thank you. So we want to focus for a bit on supporting mental health. And some ways that we can do that are by actually getting to know ourselves, getting to know what energizes us and what depletes us, knowing what works for you and what doesn't, learning what's supportive for you and what isn't, and where your edges are, what makes you stressed, when do you know you're starting to get stressed, and what helps to alleviate that, as well as what your capacities are. So this was a hard one for me to learn. I have friends who are, I would say, very productive. And it's not that I'm not, but I've learned from myself that I actually need a lot of downtime. And so part of learning my own capacity has been being able to say no, learning how to set boundaries, but also learning how to listen to my body. And we each have like different ways that our body might be speaking to us about what feels good and what doesn't, and when we're burning out and when we're not, or when we're thriving. So the next is getting to know your social location. And we're going to talk about each of these three a little bit more in depth. So that's essentially your context. And then the third is your boundaries. You can go back. Thank you to the next one. Thank you. So this slide is in the worksheet that you got, and it's basically a wellness map. So it's a way to reflect on who you are and what supports you through tough times. So you can take this a step further by also reflecting on your strengths, your skills, and capacities. But this activity itself helps you to resource yourself and recognize where you already have supports. So I've done this both with groups where if we had a bit more time, people could spread out and start to do it themselves, and then share something that helps them feel energized. I've done it with teens and also adults, and also one-on-one. And one of the recommendations I have is if you have some time just to do it on your own, put it somewhere that you can come back to it. That when you notice that your capacity is being depleted, or you notice you're struggling a bit, you can come to it as a map to say, okay, what is one of these resources that I can reach out for today? And I think often, I'll just speak for myself here. Often when I'm starting to struggle with my mental health, I can have days where I'm like, I actually don't know what would be helpful. And I've found this tool to be really helpful, because then I have those things all already thought through, and I can go and reach for one. So the next page, you'll see the wheel of power and privilege. And this is really about getting to know your social location, learning and thinking about what is your context. Where do you carry power and privilege? Where do you carry responsibility? And where have you been impacted by oppression? As well as thinking through, what do you need to heal in your life? and where are places that you can support your own healing. And this can be a tool to start to think about, your context in a little bit more of a deeper way. And then the third, and this is also in your worksheet. And then the third slide is on setting boundaries. So embodiment practitioner and teacher Prentice Hemphill says that boundaries are the distance at which I can love both myself and you simultaneously. Equally, sociologist Brene Brown, in her research on belonging, discovered that the most boundaried people are also the most compassionate people. So boundaries actually help us to protect our energy so that we don't burn out, while simultaneously giving us the space and the ability to recognize our interconnections. And there is a page on your worksheet with these questions just to think through what boundaries look like for you and what is helpful for you in setting boundaries. And then the next page. So these are some other mental health tools. Excuse me. So these are all within the context of knowing yourself and your rhythms. And I'm going to let Alana-Dawn speak to this.
Yeah, thanks, Jodi. And I see you have a comment in the chat about dropping the workbook. We can definitely email you after. Please reach out to me if you haven't got it yet. Okay, so we also wanted to cover some other mental health tools to support in your climate emotions. And keeping in mind what Jodi was just sharing about, this is all within the context of knowing yourself and what's going to be helpful for you, depending where you're at and where your level's at with your climate grief and what you need. So that's why we also reference it's really important to be more familiar with the terms and the symptoms, so you're learning more about the topic and you're learning more how it is showing up for you. So some of the mental health tools I wanted to cover is really rooting yourself and your climate action in love. We hosted Dr. Nicole Redvers a couple of weeks ago. She's the Canadian Chair in Indigenous and Planetary Health. And when she was talking about climate grief, she was mentioning just how important it is to not get so caught up in like urgency and fear and maybe feeling like a little chaotic about trying to do your climate action and maybe being hard on yourself because you're not doing enough, but just like really rooting yourself in that love, giving yourself that grace, and rooting yourself in your love for the earth and the relationship you have with the earth, because that's what's going to sustain you and that's what's going to keep you, coming back to make positive action instead of like turning away. So this is the one that resonates with me the most right now. Time in nature is another one. There's tons of research out there that even 10 minutes going for a walk can boost your mental health. This one we also is a good example to keep in mind about like kind of the season and where you're at with your climate grief. Like as Jodi was sharing, she can anticipate the wildfire season and not even be in Alberta and feel grief around it. So if you're really in your climate grief, maybe going for a walk or camping, like when it's really smoky, is actually not going to help you. So just, it's really important to find the one that's going to work for you in the moment and what you're feeling. Self-affirmations is really good. Like maybe if you're feeling fatigued, to kind of help re-energize yourself and come more from a positive frame. But again, if you're really heightened in frustration, maybe what you need is to connect with the community and figure out an action you can take. Breathing exercises and mindfulness is a really great tool. Practicing mindfulness can help you to catch those kind of like racing thoughts that you might be feeling, so that you can kind of like slow down and say, okay, I'm listening to you, anxiety, I hear you. I'm going to take some time to process and figure out what a healthy action is now for me to take. Creative pursuits is a really amazing tool. Listening to music, even dancing, singing, going for a bike ride, just literally moves that stress and the climate emotion through you, and you can come forward with a clearer head. Learn about transformative work that's happening. I saw someone kind of say that earlier in the chat, I think, but don't get caught up so much in the doom scrolling. Like make sure you are learning about the really good work that's happening out there. Like the other day, I learned a woman from Kenya created bricks by melting down plastic and mixing it with sand, and plastic pollution was a really big deal in her city. So now she's created this brick that's also acts as like an affordable, accessible product for making homes. So there's lots of amazing stuff out there. I just really encourage we continue to like learn about it, support it, advocate for it. The next one I wanted to share is around connecting with community. You don't always have to have the pressure to like be the perfect climate activist or do all the things that align with your values, because truthfully, some of those individual actions aren't always accessible to you. And sometimes we're just overwhelmed with what's going on in our own life. So just, connecting to community, having these conversations around your climate grief, I would say is a big act of climate action because you're helping to normalize this conversation and hopefully it reaches wider circles too. Counseling and supports we highly recommend too. I've seen counseling, so if you're ever noticing that this is like significantly impacting your day to day and like, whether it's going to work or going to classes, like that's time to just reach out and start talking to someone or support groups. The next one we wanted to highlight is spiritual practice and meditative practice. And we are going to get the chance to practice that with Jodi in just a minute. But if you aren't already familiar with this, there are lots of studies that kind of highlight the benefits of meditative practice. It really helps you to kind of like feel in the moment what you're feeling and also release it through meditation. Other ways I find it beneficial is it just gives me the chance to slow down and come reach more into my gratitude and kind of feel how interconnected I am with the air, the trees, the water, all these things that literally hold me up and give me life. And it kind of helps bring back some strength into how I'm feeling. Um, Meditation doesn't always need to be like a 10-minute, 15-minute thing you got to find every day. Like it could be simple as doing those box breathing, when you notice that you're feeling anxious, just do some like simple breathing, hold it for 4 seconds and let it go. So that is also a form of meditation, I'd say. So yeah, I'm gonna pass to Jodi and we're gonna practice meditation together.
Thanks, Alana-Dawn. So we're going to practice a meditation today that is a meditation for eco-anxiety. And it is a guided meditation called a Tonglen, which it comes from the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. And it's a meditation that focuses on giving and receiving, which can be particularly helpful for dealing with climate anxiety and despair. So this practice was created and adapted by Dakila Changyalpa, who's the co-founder and director of the Loka Initiative, which is an organization at the University of Wisconsin-Madison for faith leaders and cultural keepers of Indigenous traditions who work on environmental and climate issues together. And it was adapted by her from His Holiness the 17th Karmapa, who is the Tibetan Buddhist leader within the Karmapa, and was adapted as a way to meet our emotions related to climate change with an attitude of curiosity and gentleness. So I'm going to invite you just to start by grounding yourself with the earth beneath you. So take a minute or two and find a spot where you feel comfortable. That could be seated in your chair, but it could also be on the floor, just somewhere where you can hear my voice okay for a few minutes. And I'll just give you a minute or two to do that. If you want, you're also welcome to turn off your screen if you do have your screen on, as long as you can hear my voice. And I'm going to invite you as well, if at any point during this meditation, you start to feel a bit overwhelmed or flooded by emotion, just to return to your breath and just notice the rise and fall of your chest as you breathe in and you breathe out, and to allow yourself to focus on that instead of my words or my voice. So I'll invite you now to extend your awareness to how your body touches your seat or the floor, and how through these layers you're rooted to the earth. Become aware of how the earth holds you up. There are many possible reasons why you have joined us today. You may be overwhelmed by the news. You may be mourning the loss of lives. You may be afraid of what the future brings, or it may be something else entirely. Eco-anxiety can manifest in many ways, including grief, anger, vulnerability, sadness, fear. However it manifests, whether an emotion or sensation, I want to invite you to observe it from a short distance without letting it wash you away. When you've made a connection with your eco-anxiety, acknowledge it with respect. It is a completely valid response to an existential threat. It means your inner warning system is working, and your emotions come from a place of love and compassion for people, for wildlife, and for nature. Take however long you need to honor your eco-anxiety with compassion. Whatever responses arise, whatever emotions come up, whatever fear shows up, let it all flow out of you and into the earth. Notice your incoming breath, the air entering your nostrils, your mouth, filling up your belly. All that oxygen keeps you alive. That keeps you alive comes from the plants, the trees, the oceans, and the plankton around us. All the food we eat, the clothes we wear, the houses that shelter us come from nature. The very basis of our lives is interdependence with the earth. Rest in this awareness and relax here, trusting that you are indivisible from nature. And I invite you now to breathe in the earth's compassion and breathe out gratitude. Breathe in the earth's compassion and breathe out gratitude. Breathe in the earth's compassion and breathe out gratitude. Begin to move into giving and receiving. From a place of caring and compassion, imagine yourself with the ability to draw out the suffering. This could be your own. It could be a friend's, a river, animals, a forest, your community, or anything that came up for you today. When you inhale, draw in the suffering, and as you exhale, send healing. If it helps, you can imagine the suffering in the form of a fog or a vapor. And as you inhale, you receive the suffering. As you exhale, you give compassion and healing. This might bring up fear or anxiety. And if that happens, I simply want to invite you to go back to grounding yourself with the earth and rest in her compassion for you. When you're ready, come back to this practice of giving and receiving. Give compassion and receive their suffering. I'm going to invite you to breathe together in this practice 3 more times. Inhale suffering. Exhale, sending healing and compassion. Inhale suffering. Exhale, sending healing and compassion. Inhale suffering and exhale, sending healing and compassion. And now I want to invite you to reverse the direction of giving and receiving. It's time again for us to receive the earth's compassion and to offer our gratitude in return. Take a minute to hold in and to be with the earth's compassion for you. And then together, I'll invite us to breathe in the earth's compassion and breathe out gratitude. Breathe in the earth's compassion and breathe out gratitude. And once again, to breathe in the earth's compassion and to breathe out gratitude. And as you emerge from this practice, I'll invite you, if you need to move, or sometimes it's helpful to stretch or shake a little bit, to come back into your body and into this moment. And to notice what it feels like to transform your eco-anxiety into the motivation to heal yourself and others. So you can set the intention to return to this practice whenever you feel depleted. You can also practice short moments, as Alana-Dawn was talking about earlier, of giving gratitude and receiving compassion from the earth throughout your day. So maybe it's just a moment here or a moment there. And for those who might feel energized by the practice, a next step could be moving into some sort of practical action to help protect what you love. Whatever the case, we hope that this practice will help you, and through you, that it may heal the earth. So I'll just give us a minute to kind of come back into the space. And then I'll just also invite, if there are things that folks would like to put in the chat about how that felt for them, just to put that in the chat as we're talking, as a way of sharing. Typically, when we would be facilitating something like this, with multiple of our activities today, we would take some time to debrief them together. But unfortunately, the online nature of this and the shorter amount of time just doesn't really give us the time to do that. So I'm hopeful that you'll be able to do that just a little bit in the chat as well. So we're going to move into talking about a few more kind of tools. Alana-Dawn, if you don't mind.
Thanks. Yeah, I was just noticing in the chat just some comments. Really enjoyed it. Relaxed, connected, lovely, helpful to feel the compassion for self. Thanks everyone for sharing. I also did see the comments about people who haven't received the resource. So I'm going to put my email in the chat. We can't, unfortunately, it's not a web-based resource. So if you email me, I can email you back the resource. So I just put it there in the chat. Yeah, I'm feeling more relaxed too. Thanks, Jodi.
Well, and I just wanted to say too, like, sometimes that meditation can be really helpful. And sometimes for some folks, it brings up feeling blocked or numbed or frustrated. And that's okay too. Like whatever response you might have to the meditation, kind of coming back to the invitations at the beginning, I'll invite you just to get curious about that and to get curious about like what is happening for you as you experience some of these things. And thank you for, practicing with us.
Thanks, Jodi. So the work that reconnects we've kind of referenced throughout a bit today, but we just also really wanted to highlight it. This is also Joanna Macy's work that she's kind of built over the years in cooperation with many colleagues. And it draws on the teachings of Indigenous communities, systems thinking, deep ecology, deep time, spiritual traditions, and anti-oppression. And this is, it's just a really great practice. It's a set of practices. It offers a really powerful lens. The practice can be done individually or in community to support processing climate emotions, to start healing, connecting with your interdependence with the earth and all life. And it kind of helps guide you to come to a new vision and creativity, see how you can apply your strengths and skills to a collective movement moving forward. So it is a spiral. You could see it, you could really start at any point, and you could also be feeling multiple things at any given point too. But we do tend to practice it through a spiral, but it's definitely not linear. So kind of start from coming from gratitude, just drawing that strength and being grateful for the earth and life. And then honoring your pain for the world and just really taking the time to process that, trying to heal yourself and others if you're doing it in community, which we really encourage you to do. And through that, once you've moved through your pain, you kind of get these new insights. There's this new sense of creativity. There's this new sense of motivation to try new things and kind of go forth now, with what you've kind of learned about yourself and with community and how you want to move forward. So it's really helpful. It's empowering and a healing practice. So I'm going to put it in the chat if you aren't already connected with it. And again, this is what guides the work that Reconnects monthly group that Jodi leads. So I recommend you check it out.
And I'll maybe just say that it is unfortunately a monthly in-person group. So for those of you who live in Mogenstous or in Calgary, you're definitely welcome to come and check it out. It's a free drop-in group that's kind of centered around just building community capacity around these conversations and building some connection around them. The work that reconnects.org does have kind of, I think, monthly and seasonal offerings as well that for folks who would like to or are able to join online. So you can take a look at their work there as well, and it's practitioners from all over the world. So as we continue on, we're going to talk just a little bit about some simple ways to practice community care. And so this could be, the context for this could be with your group of friends, it could be workplace, it could be with a community group that you're already organizing with or connecting with consistently. And these are just a few ways that Alana-Dawn and I have either practiced community care or have been thinking about community care. So the first is group check-ins. So normalizing conversations about sadness and anxiety and mental health without rushing to fix things. I've seen this done in a lot of different ways, just by even checking in with how are people doing today. It could be a more formal check-in, like, I don't know if it's more formal, but like, what sort of animal are you connecting with today? Or more than human creature. Could also be something like the one that I've done in the past, it's a little more intense, is called MESP, and it's checking in around mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical health. And whenever I've run that one, it's always with the invitation, you can share each of those things, or you can just share from one place of those things. And I think one thing that's important to note is in these sorts of conversations, giving people lots of options and opportunities to engage in ways that feel good to them is really important. So always having just the flexibility for someone to not share as well. The next is have people take turns by bringing a poem or a meditative activity to open your group, and then giving them time to share or to journal about that, or even like a reading that they maybe find inspirational. And the next is to plan retreat or mental wellness moments or activities and incorporate this into your communities, using nature as a guide or a mentor. So when I lived and worked at the retreat center, once every 6 weeks, our staff would actually take a community day where all of the staff would leave the center together. We'd often go on a hike and enjoy being in nature together. So that's a somewhat formalized, also informal way of doing it. You could also go on a guided walk together, or you could ask people to do a little bit of meditation outside together. There's a whole host of different ways that you can practice this, and we'll talk a bit more about what some of those practices could be in a minute. And the next is to honor boundaries, giving people the permission to say no and helping them practice it, which I think often can be really challenging. Many of us probably live and work in places where productivity is really valued, and there can feel pressure to say yes to everything and then become overwhelmed by doing too many things, or maybe sometimes we don't even have the luxury of saying no. And so in our spaces where we can, I really want to invite us to honor each other's boundaries and to start to think about what those look like for you. And then to share a meal or potluck together. And this is a very simple way of practicing community care together. But bringing people together around food, I feel like always brings people together in unique and different ways that inspire and create community. The next is a book club. So there's a number of books in your package and also at the resources a couple slides down that you could use. You could use anything from Act of Hope, which Alana-Dawn mentioned earlier, to there's a whole host of books that have come out around supports for climate, anxiety, and mental health that you could use in a book club together and actually start to talk about these things. And then the next is to connect with other people around conversations of climate change and mental health. And that could just be a simple conversation on a day when there's a lot going on in some part of the world, or when you're experiencing something like we experience here with smoke, just checking in with someone that you know is either struggling with that, or connecting with someone and saying, hey, can we chat a bit about this? I'm really having a hard time with the smoke today. And you can start to build capacity in your relationships around that. And then the next slide, these are a few ways that Refugia has done community care kind of activities in the past. So the activity on the left was actually an activity that a friend and I did when we were like thinking back about the different things we had experienced in our connection with nature in the last year and in our own relationship together. And we basically took about an hour, took separate walks, and found things that would not harm the environment to take, and just created an art piece together as a way to reflect on what the last year had been for us. The middle is actually from that clear cut that I was talking about from when I lived in the Ghost. And after the clear cut was completed, we unfortunately were not successful in getting any of it stopped. After it was completed, about 50 of us community members came together, and I led a kind of a grief ritual on the land, where people were again invited to walk the land and to notice what they were grieving and to find something that symbolized that. And then we came back together and made a cairn or an altar together. And this is actually from Joanna Macy's work, the work that reconnects. There's an activity called a cairn of mourning. All of her work is open source and free, and you can find it on her website. And then after that, we had a potluck together and just talked about what we appreciated about that community during the time that we were trying to get the clear cut stopped, and how we wanted to move forward together. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see a hanging mobile. And so during COVID, an organization brought us in to do an online facilitation, making some sort of eco art together. And so what we did is we invited participants before the online facilitation. We gave them some instructions and invited them to create something from things they found in the natural world, again, that they would not harm from taking, and to create something that really symbolized what they were feeling in this season. And this mobile is actually what I created. And it was based on feeling very suspended in that moment. And like all of our lives were kind of hanging in the balance, not really sure what was going to happen next. And then we came onto Zoom together. And with a little bit of guidance and some poems to kind of ground the space, we each had the opportunity to share in whatever way we felt comfortable what we had made. So for some folks, that was just showing what they had made. And for others, it was actually explaining kind of that process around it, or the feelings that were connected to it for them. And so these all are activities that I've done in guided spaces. However, these are all fairly simple activities that you could do on your own, or even do with a group of friends at some point as well. Community care doesn't have to be really complicated. It can be just thinking about ways that we can start to access some of those emotions together in community and support each other when we do need to talk about things. So then the next slide. Thanks, Alana-Dawn.
Thanks, Jodi. So we had before we go into small group discussion, we had a really good question pop up around how to find community supports, I think in person, like if you don't live in Alberta. I know we have some online ones, and I know you do retreats in the States as well. So I was wondering if you had any additional.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I suggest looking at the work that reconnects.org, because they do, there are practitioners kind of all over the world. And so there might be someone in your area that you could connect with who already has a group space happening. Also, the Climate Psychology Alliance .org, they often have different community supports that are happening, as well as the goodgrief.org network. And then I think, and then again as well, Refugia, I will sometimes do online communities of practice. Those aren't the same as being in person with folks. And so if you're looking for folks in your neighborhood, I'd say one good way to start is like looking at what sort of environmental organizations exist in your community, or looking at what sort of naturalist organizations or climate activism organizations, and then getting to know some people from there. This could is also something, depending on like on your own desire that you could think of who do you know, if you know of a few friends that might be interested in starting something together. And it can just start with like starting to have a conversation about it. I hope that's kind of helpful. Alana-Dawn, do you have anything to add to that?
No, you were the online groups you listed were the ones I was thinking of, and yeah, just I really like that advice around connecting with some climate groups because they probably would maybe know someone, hopefully in your area. So yeah, sorry, nothing to add. I thought you really gave really good advice. Okay, so we're gonna move into small group discussions now. I think 5 minutes, Jodi, you think? We're almost at the end. I know we're like 10 minutes to noon. So thanks so much for everyone who's still here. We're going to give an opportunity for you to share kind of what you learned today or anything that really resonated with you, and reflect on any resources or tools that you found really helpful. And then after that, we'll kind of come back together, share more resources, and then end with a poll.
So these are some resources that you'll also find in that guidebook that you received. And these are books that focus on eco-grief and climate anxiety or climate emotions, as well as some organizations that do too. So for those who are local, the Alberta Council for Environmental Education often has resources, so you could take a look there. Alana-Dawn, I think, can speak a bit to the U of C resources that exist. And then also the Good Grief program at Fish Creek Park is a program of, I think, working through kind of eco-grief as well. And then there's also some online resources like ecoanxious.org and mindandlife.org. And so we just encourage you to take a look at them and see what kind of feels like it fits with your life. There are also a number of books that you will, there's a few here, and then there's quite a few more in the package as well. So those are just some of those resources. And then I guess the final thing to say too is I also do one-to-one support, coaching around climate anxiety and climate grief. And so I work with folks individually, both online, so both remotely and also in person. If that's something that you're interested in, please feel free to reach out to me. And then just to address the question in the chat from Lisa as well. So the in-person sessions in Calgary, so some of them you can find out through me. So if you sign up to the newsletter at refugiaretreats.com, periodically, usually I try to send something out monthly that talks about things that are going on in Calgary and the things that Refugia is doing. And that would include work like this with the U of Calgary. And then Alana-Dawn, do you have some suggestions for how to find out about Calgary resources as well?
Like other than the ones you've shared, like if you, at least if you're at U of Calgary, you could definitely reach out to me and I can connect you with the climate cafe that meets up. And I'm actually just putting in the website for Refugee Retreats in the chat for everyone if you want to check that out.
Thank you.
And then these are also some local counselors who are climate aware. So
Yes.
also welcome to reach out to them.
And if you know of others, please feel free to reach out to Alana-Dawn or I and let us know, because we'd love to keep updating our list.
Okay, so today's event was part of You Flourish. Thanks so much to Amy and Michelle for inviting us. If you don't know already, if you are part of UCalgary, right now, UCalgary is undergoing a renewal of its campus mental health strategy. So you can find out more at this website and how you can give your input to it. For students who might be looking for any wellness support, please check out the ucalgary.ca wellness services. They have a whole host of supports that can support you, from peer support, groups, one-to-one counseling, and self-help resources. For staff and faculty, please connect with the ucalgary.ca/HR-wellness to find resources for you. If anyone, later on feels like kind of really wanting that immediate support because you're having strong thoughts or feelings, these are some resources available that are 24 hours. So I'll highlight for staff, TELUS Health, the phone number there. We'll also email this out to everyone. And the Distress Center also has 24/7 crisis resources for anyone. Phone number is 403-266-4357.
And then we just wanted to finish our session with you with a poem. So this is called The Struggle Continues by Israel Bafarde. And it goes like this. The road that lies ahead of us is a long one, and the pace of progress will sometimes feel glacially slow. Never forget that glaciers over time can carve out Grand Canyons and Great Lakes. Moving tectonic plates can rise up over mountains over millennia, or can explode awe-inspiring volcanoes in milliseconds. Our commitment to love and justice can do the same. Thank you all so much for attending.